anti-Semitic incidents in Melbourne. The rabbis had a briefing today from the head of CSG, from Justin Kagan, and he told us that from the 7th of October to the 28th of November last year, there were 13 physical anti-Semitic incidents in Melbourne.
How many?
13.
Okay.
So
Not online, this is
what
excluding
dates?
online.
So all of last year, or what?
No. From the 7th of October 2022 to the 28th of November 2022.
Okay, so we're looking at the same period.
Last year, a month
Year
and a
on
half,
year.
let's say,
Yep.
a month and a half. And then this year, we had 155. Now, until very recently, in English-speaking countries, you would say the word Jew, someone would say back to you the Holocaust. But as of now, if you say to someone Jew, they're going to say Israel. So tonight's conversation isn't a theoretical shiur like we often give. This is happening every day around us, physically in Melbourne, and it's also happening online wherever we go. What I want to do tonight is, we're actually doing a tag team, John and I. It's an ensemble piece tonight. We're going to look at anti-Semitism historically, look at the background ideologically, and come up with a real reason why Jews are hated. We have to do this because we have to know what we're up against. Okay? In reality, we are, to a certain degree, at war with anti-Semites right now.
Yes.
Okay. If you have a look through anti-Semitic, I don't mean anti-Semitic literature, but studies of anti-Semitism, there are basically 7 classic reasons that come out. The first is that we claim that we're the chosen people, and we're hated because we claim that we're better than everybody else. The second is deicide. It's a specific Christian accusation against the Jew that we killed Jesus. The third is economics. We hate the Jews because they're money grubbing and they control the world's economy. Number 4 is a scapegoat. It's not that there's anything specifically wrong with the Jews, but they're always in the wrong place at the wrong time. Race, which is the one they used in the Holocaust. Jews are a different and inferior race. Outsiders. You can't really trust the Jews. They do things differently, they think differently, they dress differently, and when they can, they live on their own. And the last one, and the most popular one now, is anti-Zionism. We hate the Jews because they're colonialist oppressors of the indigenous people of Palestine. There are 7 classic reasons for anti-Semitism. Now, before we look at any of them in depth, I want to explore the difference between a reason and an excuse. A reason is an essential cause for something. If you take away that reason, then the problem goes away. So this is like, doctor, anytime I drink tea, I get a pain in my eye. Okay, take out the spoon. Right? The spoon is the reason you've got a pain in your eye. Once you take out the spoon, you can drink tea without pain. An excuse, on the other hand, is a smoke screen. It's what you pretend is the reason, but it's not really the reason. And so if you remove the excuse, the real reason will still present a problem. Right? This is, sorry teacher, the dog ate my homework, but you don't have a dog. So it must have been something else. There's some other reason why you didn't do it. Okay, that's an excuse and a reason. So now, if I can figure out the reason for anti-Semitism and I can remove that, then anti-Semitism will go away. If, however, what I find is an excuse, even if I get rid of that excuse, the real reason will still stay there and anti-Semitism will stay there as well. You with me? So tonight we're going to look at what we think are the excuses, try and push them aside and figure out what the real reason is. Because you can't stop doing something you were never doing in the first place. Another important idea, there's one more thing. Just because the 7 things that are listed might turn out to be excuses doesn't mean there aren't heaps of people who believe them to be true. There are lots of things said about the Jews which we never did, but people believe anyway. Okay, let's go through our 7 one by one. We're going to analyse them, see if they are a reason for hating Jews or an excuse. And if it's an excuse, we're going to blow it up. So far, so good?
Yeah.
Great. Okay, chosen people. This, by the way, is a very common thing you hear about Jews. They're leaders. They are overrepresented in pretty much everything except for sport. And they think they have a special place in the world. 2 things to mention here. The first is that basically everyone thinks they're chosen. The Japanese flag has a red sun in the middle. Right? They're closest to the Pacific Rim, so the sun rises first in Japan. So they think they're closest to the gods. That's why they have this flag. The word China means centre of the universe. That's why you've got the word China with all the points of the compass around it. And the traditional Chinese word for non-Chinese is the same word as monkey or barbarian. So apparently Chinese people think they're chosen too. Christians and Muslims, except for a handful of fundamentalist Christians who love Jews and hate the Catholic Church and believe that salvation will come when the Jews do what they're supposed to do and then the Gentiles will be grafted in with them. Besides those, which is a minority, the rest of Christians and Muslims believe in something called supersessionism or replacement theology, which is God chose the Jews for a period of time until they screwed up, they got rejected because of their sins, and now we are the new chosen people. That's part one, called Everyone Thinks They're Chosen, so why pick on us? But then there's a second piece, and that is that at the Enlightenment, until the Enlightenment, the Jews were probably a bad treated minority. They looked at themselves as strangers in a strange land, and we're not meant to be here, Lashana Habab, Yerushalayim, etc. But with the Enlightenment came Jews who were finally allowed out of the ghettos, in Western Europe at least, and they're given citizenship, and the first thing they do is assert their culture freely, obviously, right? The answer is no, they don't. They drop everything, they assimilate as quickly as they can. How do you expect everyone to treat us the same if we look at ourselves as being visitors here? So that's really the beginning of the Reform movement. It's changed a lot since its beginning, but it was originally designed to remove barriers between Jew and Gentile so that a Jew could advance in Gentile society. So we drop keeping kosher, we drop keeping Shabbos, we don't wear kippot, the rabbi dresses like a Lutheran minister in a black robe, and some places we even move Shabbos to Sunday. And we're not Jews anymore, we're Germans of the Mosaic persuasion. Germany is our Israel, and Berlin is our Jerusalem. So that's 1844. So we're not chosen anymore. You hate us because we think we're special. We're not special. We're Germans, just like you. Did the anti-Semitism go away 1844 in Germany?
Clearly not.
Yeah, the answer is 100 years later, the greatest explosion of anti-Semitism in modern human history. Precisely in the place, by the way, where the Jews were most like the population they lived with. Which means it's an excuse. Because even if I become like you,
I'm killed.
they're still not going to like me.
Yeah.
I'm not saying because the Jews were assimilated, the biggest explosion of anti-Semitism happened. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, despite the fact that the Jews were assimilated, it happened. Which means it wasn't the real reason.
Okay.
Is that clear? Okay. Why is Jesus born and why does he die according to Christian theology? So I'm going to do it very quickly for you. I'm going to simplify it in an incredibly crude way, but it makes it very, very clear. Okay? Adam sinned, and therefore all of his descendants now are predisposed to, their soul has a blemish on it, okay, called the original sin. This is Christian theology, basic Christian theology. Now, when you have a debt and you're bankrupt, you need to get outside funding. Right? Does this make sense so far? Like when you're in trouble, you call your business angels, right? So from a Christian perspective, the reason for the sacrifices in the temple were for you to be able to repay your debt to God. So far, so good? Okay, because you couldn't pay for it yourself, you were morally bankrupt. When the temple was destroyed, you needed something other than the sacrifices to be able to offer to God. So lucky, Jesus was killed and died for your sins. He became the permanent, perfect sacrifice that you can use as your outside funding, right? Your, again, spiritual sugar daddy to be able to pay off whatever debt you have to God. It's a favour to Christians that he died. Like, whoever killed him should probably get a t-shirt saying, I saved all Christians. Because if he didn't die, you wouldn't be able to pay for your sins, right?
Well, practically,
You see that, right?
like, facilitated.
Yeah, 100%, 100%. So,
They did thank him. They created the Vatican and made it tax-free.
very good. Okay. So, he died for our sins, and if he hadn't died, what would happen to humanity? We'd all be burning in hell forever. So, it's a chesed, we would say in the old speak, that somebody killed him. That's, by the way, assuming we killed him. Of course, if you look in 3 out of the 4 of the Gospels, we didn't kill him. right? Who kills Jesus? The Romans do.
I just sent her a message.
So there's some Jews that were pushing behind it, but really it's the Romans, right? Who gets blamed? Who gets blamed for killing Jesus, even though it says in the text itself that it was the Romans? The answer is the Jews get blamed. But even more interesting than that, when did the accusations first appear? Right? Imagine you're walking in Burke Street and someone hits you across the face and they say, you know, we wanted the capital of Australia to be in Sydney. And you Melburnians insisted you wanted it in Melbourne. And now we had to wrestle you for it. And now it's in Canberra. And Canberra has the worst nightlife ever. How could you do that to us? Right? You look at the guy like he's crazy. You would say, why do you have issues now? My great-grandfather didn't have an issue with your great-grandfather. Like, why do you bring it up now? If it was an issue, it should have been brought up at the beginning. But logically, you would expect the Christ killer accusations to be right after the event. Where's the first recorded episode of Jews as Christ killers? In the First Crusade. So that's the 11th century, 1,000 years later. Now, we didn't do it, the Romans did it, and he had to die. Otherwise, if we didn't kill him, someone else would have to kill him, because that's how the theology works. And the accusations are 1,000 years too late. So none of this makes sense so far. But even more interesting than that was what Doron brought up. That in 1965, Pope Paul XXIII issued the Vatican II. Right? The Pope is infallible. He says, we can't blame all the Jews at the time of Jesus for his death, because I'm sure there were only a few of them. And even if there were a few of them then, I mean, we can't blame people 2,000 years later. We can't blame the Jews for killing, you know, for what their ancestors did. So immediately you would expect anti-Semitism amongst the Catholics, like 1 billion people right there, should have been Jews drop all over the world. The Pope is infallible. He says the Jews are guiltless. Does the anti-Semitism go away? No, because it's not the real reason. And the truth is, if you look at Christian hatred of Jews, you see some of the wildest excuses in history for hating Jews anywhere. England in particular invented some of the weirdest accusations against Jews. Jews have a prohibition. Kosher meat has to be completely free from
blemishes.
Blood.
Oh yeah, blood.
Offerings,
That's it,
sacrifices need
sorry.
to be free from.
Yes,
from
I'm confusing.
yeah?
I was going to say.
Can't have blood in it. So what are the Jews accused of starting in Norwich, England in 1144?
Making matzahs out of blood.
So here's a picture. Oh, that's not the blood libel I was thinking of. Sorry. Oh, wait. That's not the blood libel I was thinking of either. Okay. The blood libel's in Norwich. We're going to do a multiple choice question.
Oh. It's like water, but it's really meant to be blood.
It's blood. Yeah, correct.
It looks like water.
Lucky it's
Okay.
black and white, right?
I was going to say, yeah.
Okay.
It's like a
Number
fountain.
one. Option one. Was it A, the chief ingredient in matzah? B, as a punishment for killing Jesus, all Jews suffer from hemorrhoids, and the only cure for hemorrhoids is Christian baby's blood? C, all Jewish men menstruate, and they need a monthly blood transfusion? Or D, when Jewish men are circumcised, they lose so much blood that they need to use Christian baby's blood to replenish the loss? Or is it E, all of the above?
All of the above.
Yeah, it's all of the above. Blood libels against the Jews are not just in medieval Europe, you find them today. Okay, the third one is a very popular one. Economic theory, the Jews control the world's economy, and the media, and Hollywood. They're really all the same accusation of Jews have inordinate amount of power. Okay, this is a cartoon from Der Stürmer. Der Stürmer is the stormtrooper, like it was the Nazi Party propaganda paper in the 30s and 40s. This is from 1938, so you can see here the Jew trying to get into other countries because things aren't going well for them in Germany, but most notably they're very well fed, and you'll see they've also got the little Jewish bag of money over there that they're carrying with them. So where does the idea from the Jews control the world's economy come from? So this is also medieval Christian. This is moneylenders, Jews as moneylenders. Why did Jews lend money in medieval Europe?
That was the only job they were allowed to do.
Yeah, so one is they were blocked from other professions. All the guilds that all the craftspeople had wouldn't let them in. And also because the Catholic Church forbids lending other Christians money with interest.
Oh, that's right.
So in order for businesses to work, they've got to be able to borrow money in order to do business and then make money. So you have to have a bank. So Jews were made the bankers of Europe. Why does it make you hated? Because who wants to pay a guy back with interest, right? Now, to be fair, the Jews charged about 45% interest. It's a lot of interest. It wasn't generally something that most Jews became rich doing, because at any point that you didn't want to pay back the Jew, you could confiscate his stuff, you could dog him into the government, you could run a little pogrom, like there were a whole bunch of options. You could expel them from your neighbourhood. There were quite a lot of options. It's not that we hate Jews because they lend money. We hate Jews already, so let's give them something that will make them more hated. How do I know? Because by the Renaissance, Jews don't have enough money to lend the sums of for Europe. And by that time, by the way, the church is a little less powerful. So the Italian banking families, the Lombards of northern Italy, take over. What were the rates the Jews charged? 45%. What were the rates that the Lombards charged? 245%.
Whoa.
5 times as much, but you don't hear a thing about the Lombards, right? In fact, I googled today anti-Lombardism, and there were 876 results.
You make party shops that national
I
name
also
them.
googled anti-Semitism, and you get over 60 billion hits. There are actually letters from communities where Jews have been expelled asking Jews to be readmitted so they can borrow from Jews instead of from the Italian banking families, right? No one attacks the Lombards because the fact that Jews lend money and that's the reason they're hated is an excuse. More recently, by the way, so this is now about 120 years ago, the Protocols of Elders of Zion was written in Russia. It was written by one of the secret police of the Tsar of Russia. They were called the Black 100, which does make them sound very, very scary. The plot of the book is, it's a forgery, but the plot of the book is that Jews get together, the rabbis and the heads of the UAA and the UJA and all the big federations get together, and they plot the next 100 years of Jewish world domination. Now, how do we know it's not true? Because anyone who thinks 10 rabbis in a room can agree on anything. Yeah, that's never met a
That
Jew in
should
their
have been
life.
your dad joke.
Isn't
at
that
the start
true
of the
though?
night.
That's totally true. Now,
Well,
as
it's half,
ridiculous,
it's half true. These organisations do come together.
but they don't plan the next 100 years of Jewish domination. They just try and figure out how to fund the next 50 years. Okay. So, and that's just for their organisation. That's not for world domination. That's just how can we stay afloat. As ridiculous as the book is, in the 20s and 30s, thanks mostly to Henry Ford, after the Bible, it was the #1 selling book in America. There are more editions of this book in the world than every book except for the Bible and the Quran. There are 80 versions of this just in Arabic. The Japanese, who have almost no Jews in their population, buy all kinds of copies of this book because they believe it's true. And they figure to themselves, if the Jews do run the world's economy, then I want to be their friends and figure out how to do business with them. The reality accusation is that Jewish money is a post-Holocaust thing. If you look a few generations back in your family is probably middle class, maybe upper middle class, but the vast majority of Jews weren't. The vast majority were middle class at best and poor most likely. Jewish money is completely post-Holocaust. But even if the Jews did pose a money threat in the 30s, by the mid-30s, the Jews are robbed of all of their economic progress. Yeah, they have the Nuremberg laws, 1935. The bank accounts are frozen, their jobs are taken away, their property and their businesses are confiscated, their shops are looted and taken from them. If we hate the Jews because they control the economy, now that we've completely neutralised the Jewish money threat, we don't have to kill them, right?
No.
You understand the problem, right?
Yeah.
And then a few years later, we have to gas these people because apparently the money thing is just an excuse. It's not the real reason to get rid of the Jews. Okay, scapegoat. This is a very popular one, right? It's not really that we hate the Jews for a specific reason. They're just the scapegoat we use for every problem out there. You've heard such a thing? It's, by the way, a very, very popular thing in academic literature.
Yeah.
There were 2 goats taken. One was symbolically, the high priest would confess the sins on the animal, and then the animal was sent to the desert and thrown off a cliff. Now, I'm not going to get into the animal rights piece tonight, it's for another night, but the idea is that the animal is guiltless, right? And you're transferring guilt to it. That's why it's called a scapegoat. Jews are made scapegoats, but no one ever said, I hate the Jews because they're scapegoats. They said stuff like, the economy in Germany is terrible, and therefore I blame the Jews for it, right? You can't just pick people out of the hat. You have to find people who you already hate to make it work. But there's a book called Hitler's Willing Executioners by Daniel Goldhagen, talking about how which German people, the civilians, were in cahoots with the Nazi party. It wasn't just the Nazis doing all the killing. It took the rest of Germany to make the program work. That's the assertion of the book. Now, on the front of the book, you've got a famous photo from the 30s, and in the background of the photo at the top, there's a huge banner, and it reads, "The Jews are our misfortune. Die Juden sind unser Unglück." Okay, the Jews are our misfortune. And what's the crowd doing while he's talking? They're excited, yeah! Right, he's blaming the Jews for everything and everyone's going, yeah! Okay, now Hitler gets up and he says, "My fellow German people, we must fight the enemy of all humanity, the midgets." The whole audience goes, "What the hell? What happened to you, Hitler? That makes zero sense, right?" Meaning, when you hear about the Jews, because you already hate them, you're happy to hear all the other problems they've brought on. But because the midgets have never done, you don't hate them at all. You go, why would you make the midgets a scapegoat? You can only make a scapegoat of someone you already don't like. So this is just another episode of an excuse. Gabby, welcome. Okay, now we have the idea of race. Race is the most modern anti-Semitism piece. Again, I should say until anti-Zionism. This was the one used by Hitler. It's basically a perversion of Darwin's theory of evolution, and specifically for Germany, the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche, who, based on my reading, I wouldn't say was anti-Semitic. I think his stuff was taken out of context. Nietzsche's basic idea was there are superior races and inferior races, and just like you don't want the bad animals to mix and mate with the good animals, right, because they'll make them weaker, so we want the same thing in race. We're going to separate the races. The ultimate race, who was the Übermensch, the Superman, you would call it in English, was the blonde-haired, blue-eyed Northern European called the Aryan, and then in contrast, you had the Jew on the other extreme, right? You always see Nazi propaganda pictures of Jews with big noses, and they've got curly hair and a double chin, and they're greasy and ugly and fat, right? That's the racial stereotype of a Jew. Now, it's nonsense, of course, because there are countless stories of Jews escaping Nazi Germany by looking Aryan. Well, how could that be if they're a race that have specific facial features, as an example? If you go to Israel, you'll see Jews of all shapes and sizes, right? You go to an Ethiopian, you say, "You don't look Jewish." They say, "What do you mean? You don't look Jewish." "Yeah, everyone where I come from looks just like me," right? It's nonsense. There's no such thing as a Jewish race. Outsiders. And I think this is something that we can all relate to, because people who are different than us make us naturally nervous, right? Suspicion, fear, hostility. Jews, by the way, have chosen sometimes to dress and act and live apart from other people. If you go to Mea Shearim, the religious area of Jerusalem today, you'll see how ultra-Orthodox Jews dress, and it's not how we see people walking along the street. I think sometimes we have chosen to dress differently. Sometimes we have been forced to dress differently. So sometimes we've been given hats, we've been given little yellow stars. In the picture of Satan talking to the Jewish moneylenders earlier tonight, there was actually a little circle. That badge wasn't a yellow star badge; it was a coin. Right? Satan was wearing a coin because he was part of the moneylending club. But usually when you walk down the street in Caulfield, again, maybe Shabbos is an exception, but when you walk down the street in Melbourne, it's very difficult to tell who's Jewish and who's not. The situation for most Jews, for most of history, especially in Europe, was that they did dress differently, act differently, look different. And you see this everywhere, by the way. It's not just Jews. You know, if you're a black in a white country, or you're a Sikh walking around with a turban in a country where no one's wearing turbans, people are going to look at you a little strange. But again, you get to that Enlightenment stage about 200 years ago, where Jews are let out of the ghetto and allowed to become citizens. And like in Germany, they throw off all the things that make them look different. Napoleon emancipated the Jews. This is one of Napoleon's generals. And he's fine. I'll take off my kippah and I'll eat in your restaurants, and Chaya Mushka Goldberg will marry Frederick von Schumacher, and I'll be just like you. Yeah, what should happen to if the problem is the dislike of the unlike, what should happen to the hatred? It should go down.
Disappear.
It should disappear. So this, by the way, this is real for us as well. Our great-grandparents came from Russia or Poland or something, and they spoke a foreign language and they spoke English with an accent, right? My grandmother used to say, it took us a long time to get here. Right? That was her, like, you understand? Yeah? So they look different, and they come to Australia, but like their grandchildren, they consider themselves Australian. And when they talk to someone else, they don't have that Italian or Jewish or whatever accent they might have had, right? This is what Jews do in the 19th century in Europe, and initially it works. And then we get to 1894 in the Dreyfus trial, which John spoke about last week or the week before? Week before, 2 weeks ago. I learnt about it in Year 9, and I never really understood its significance until I was an adult. Alfred Dreyfus was a 34-year-old Jewish captain in the French army. The fact, by the way, that a Jew could be a captain in a European army, which we think today would be normal, was completely unbelievable.
Yeah, but did they know he was Jewish?
Yeah, totally.
Oh, they totally did.
Yeah, totally. So he was set up by the French officer corps, which was still viciously anti-Semitic. They falsely accused him of being a spy for the Germans. Now, at the trial, he was framed and he was court-martialed. They ripped the buttons off his uniform, they broke his sword, and they slapped him in the face with gloves, which in those days was like a big deal. That's like unfriending you on Facebook, you understand?
Okay,
Like that's really heavy.
Or blocking you.
Yeah,
that's
correct.
like a blocking. Okay.
And they sent him to Devil's Island in the West
Death.
Indies. Yeah? There were, by the way, 2 appeals, and they framed the evidence for the appeals as well. Like there were 3 trials, and he didn't get through any of them. Covering the trial is a 34-year-old Austrian Jewish journalist from Vienna writing for the New Free Press. What's his name?
Herzl?
Theodor Herzl. Right? He's one of the most important people in the history of Zionism. He was totally assimilated like Dreyfus, but he was horrified. Because what's the crowd screaming at the trial? They're not saying "A morte Dreyfus," death to Dreyfus, kill Dreyfus. They're screaming "A morte Juif," kill the Jew. And he's like, I don't understand. We assimilated, we're just like you. What difference does it make that you would say, kill the Jew? That's not my identity. It's not Dreyfus's identity either. And he says, this is happening in France 100 years after the Enlightenment that started here. Something's not right. And he came up with like this absolutely this was a life-changing moment for Herzl, and he came to a conclusion which is very important for the class. A Jew can twist themselves into any shape he likes to escape the accusations of a non-Jew. And the hatred will not go away. You say I'm different, I'll look the same. You say I'm too the same, I'll be different, right? You say I'm too rich, fine, I'll be poor. Like, yeah, there's any of these excuses, they're never going to work, right? That was his conclusion. And so he says, he didn't found the Zionist movement, but he did join the very early Zionist movement, and his idea was, since we're not welcome in any other place, let's make our own homeland, right? We're going to have, just like the French have France, and the German nation have Germany, we Jews are going to have Jewland. Now he wasn't set on Israel, it was an option. He thought it was a good idea because it was, as far as we were concerned, it was our ancestral homeland, right? Every year after Yom Kippur is Lashana Haba Yerushalayim, right? So he said, we don't have an army, we don't have a country, we don't have any way to defend ourselves. What we need is our own country. So Herzl's conclusion was, if we only had our own country, then anti-Semitism would go away. Did that work?
Oh, how wrong it was.
So I would say it morphed. Anti-Semitism morphed into anti-Zionism, right? You could almost, Herzl died in 1904. So you could fast forward today and basically laugh and cry because not only has Israel not been the solution to anti-Semitism, it's the #1 excuse today for hating Jews. I'm not talking just about Arabs, by the way, this is all over the world. The whole thing, by the way, is ridiculous. It's based on an idea that Israel is an illegitimate state, Israel's a foreign occupier, Israelis are Nazis, that's the treatment of Palestinians, Israel's denying them a country, it's partition wars, it's all nonsense. How do we know? So I'm going to give you a short Israel history piece, and then we'll move on. Is that okay? Everyone's cool with that? Just as there are people, by the way, who legitimately criticise the Australian government during COVID, I think criticising Israeli government policy is part and parcel of being in a democracy. Right? You make yourself a celebrity, and you're going to get people roasting you on the internet. That's just how it goes, right? It's part and parcel. But when you accuse Israel of being an illegitimate state that's committed war crimes, when they haven't committed them, and there are many worse offenders in the world who you haven't said anything about, so that becomes anti-Semitism. Let's give a simple example. Genocide in Gaza. Now, let's just do the facts and then we'll talk about the perception. Right now, Israel is in northern Gaza trying to wipe out Hamas. There are 1.1 million Palestinian Arabs in the north of Gaza. Israel has relocated, not Hamas, Israel has relocated. Hamas, by the way, here is the government of Gaza, right? They haven't relocated 1 million of the 1.1 million to the south. Israel has. They made a humanitarian corridor. They've got 90% of the people out, and they're trying to get the last 100,000 civilians, most of whom have been told to stay because it makes for really good photographs when they die by Hamas, right? So they're trying to get the rest of them out. So if you're trying to perpetrate a genocide, the first thing you wouldn't do is take 90% of the people out of the firing range. But more than that, according to the UN, the average number of civilian casualties in urban warfare, so you're doing house to house, is 9 civilians to every 1 combatant. Israel is nowhere near that right now, and even if they were aiming for civilians, which they're not, they would still be not at that stage. So calling it a genocide, by the way, the complete extermination of a people solely because of who they are, is in this circumstance completely inaccurate. The accusation has existed for years, but it's not true. Here we've got, by the way, real ethnic cleansing, where you look at the Jewish population in 1948 versus now. All of the Arab countries that in 1948, when they found out Israel was building a state, they kicked out everybody on this list, right? If Israel was perpetrating a genocide, then there's no way that Arabs would start at 80,000 in Gaza and be 2 million now, right? That's backwards for a genocide. That is we are the world's worst genocidal nation, like literally in the history of the world. And honestly, Jews are pretty good at most of the things that they do. I don't know why they're so bad at this, yeah? Now, that was part one. The second thing is the double standard. We have, by the way, this is a picture of last week of the kids who took off from school to go and protest Gaza, the incredible genocide in the city. And then this week, they've got teachers and school staff in the northern suburbs of Melbourne schools. The Australian Education Union, so the Teachers Union, has told them that if they get in trouble, that the principal of the school has to call the Australian Education Union, and basically they'll get threatened to get sued. Teachers are going in with kafirs and talking about Palestine all week. Now, obviously, because they're educators, they're also going to wear a Israeli flag afterwards and talk about October 7th. Obviously, because they're teachers. But what I didn't notice was, since 2015, Saudi Arabia's killed 150,000 Yemenite Muslims, at least of which 11,000 were children. I want to show you a photo of the. There was no protest in the city. Russia's killed 10,000 civilians in Ukraine. There's a picture of the massive. China continues to detain and sterilize the Uyghur minority. 30 years they've been doing it. Here's a picture of the children in the city for it. And the world's largest refugee camp is in Bangladesh because the Muslims in Myanmar, which used to be called Burma, so like next door neighbours to India, are being killed off and expelled by the military there. You probably haven't even heard of it, yeah? And here is, of course, the protest in the city. Until World War I, the Middle East was basically ruled by the Ottoman Empire. Israel, you see Israel over here, right? This is what would be Israel now, or Palestine now, depending on which team you back for. It was neither a Jewish or Arab state. It was called Palestine just as the sort of the local name for, how like you've got electorates here. And they're not really talking about the actual area, they're just useful names to say, oh, this is the Monash area, this is the Goldstein area, right? This is whatever it is. So it was called Palestine. There was always fighting between local Jews and the Arabs, which we'll see soon. Now, the Ottomans sided with the Germans who lost the First World War, and the minhag, as we say, right? The custom is that the victors usually keep the land and divide it amongst themselves as colonies. The Allies gave out something called mandates, which is, instead of taking the land for themselves, which was basically full of Arabs that they didn't want to hang out with anyway, they said, why don't we try and figure out who's who and give each nation a state? So there were mandates handed out by the League of Nations in 1920, where Britain and France, between them, were given a mandate, which means like an obligation or a brief, right, to go and establish particular countries. So Iraq got established, Jordan got established on this side, yet Syria got established up there by the French, yeah? Brits were given a specific mandate to create a Jewish state in the Jewish historical homeland. Right? This is like the Mabo piece of history, where the Jews have maintained a connection to the land of Israel in really 3 times a day in their prayers, and pretty much everything else, including where they face to pray, all that other stuff, right? It's part and parcel of who we are. So in 1922, they give the British give they called it Transjordan, which is this funky piece here. They gave it to Jordan basically because the people who were in Jordan sided with them against the Ottomans in the war, and this was like a thank you very much. And the last one to come out was the mandate for Palestine. Now this, by the way, is a picture 1700 years before Islam was created of the 12 tribes and where they actually were in Israel. So we have like a really long-standing connection with the land. Okay, that said, we're now back in British Mandate, and even before there was a state, there was fighting, right? Most famously, the Hebron massacre in 1929 was basically where the local Arabs came in and killed as many of the local Israelis who were living in Hebron at the time. In English, it's called Hebron. You'll also see in 1941, famously, the Mufti of Jerusalem, who's basically like the chief rabbi, right? The chief rabbi of Jerusalem was meeting Hitler. They were pals. They were on the same team. So now we go to where we said we had Transjordan and Palestine. So you've got this rule in Latin called the uti possidetis juris principle. In English, what it means is when a new country is created, you have to match the previous borders as much as you can. So when Ukraine is created post-USSR, it keeps the same borders that it had during its time as the USSR. So the plan of the League of Nations was that yellow section of Palestine was going to solely become a Jewish state. The problem is you've got a practical problem, which is that, and I don't think people mention this in it, is this a pointer? Is that what that does? Cool. Feels so cool.
Mm-hmm.
The Jews basically lived, in general, along the coast, right? From Haifa to Tel Aviv. The Arabs who were there at the time, most of them lived in this area, the mountain area, which we call Judea and Samaria. And when Jordan annexed it during the war, we'll get to in a second, they called it the West Bank because it's the west bank of the Jordan River. Okay, they're on the east bank. So that was called the West Bank. And they also lived in Gaza, which is down here. Yeah, so far so good? So as a suggestion, the UN said, I don't mind you guys declaring a state, but it's probably better you just do 2 separate states, and whoever's in the leftovers. So, by the way, all this down here, people say, look how much bigger the Jewish section is. This here area right down here to Eilat is all desert. So it's nice that you gave it to us, but it's the cheap seats, guys. You got 2 problems. They said, let's create 1, 2, 3 sections for the Arabs, because that's where they are anyway. Let's create 1, 2, 3 sections for the Jews, because that's where they are in the main anyway. And whoever's left over, if you've got some Jews in here, or you've got some Arabs in here, so we'll do what they call the transfer, which is just you do swaps, right? Swapsies. Okay, so the Jews go, I'm fine with that, and we are happy to take less than the allocated original borders. And the Arabs said no. When Israel declared its independence in the middle of 48, 5 Arab armies invaded to try and get the whole thing away from the Jews. So now, even before we've declared a state, we're getting fought with by all the surrounding nations. So during the war, post-war, what happens is Egypt, where's the, oh, wrong button, there we go. Egypt here goes, right now they have the Sinai, they come in here and they steal the Gaza Strip, which was never part of,
in 48.
this is 48, this is post-war, so 48 plus a year of fighting, let's say. So Egypt took the Gaza Strip, right, everyone with me so far? Jordan took what they called the West Bank of the Jordan River, we call Judea is down here, Samaria is up here, and these two became Jordanian. So until 1967, when we got them back, they were Egypt's, illegally by the way, because the UN never said, you guys should take the Gaza Strip, and the West Bank became Jordanian. Now, how many resolutions do you think the UN came up with to tell Egypt to give back the Gaza Strip and Jordan to give back the West Bank?
I'm still looking for them.
Yeah, 0, right? Here's another question, and it's the same as the deicide. If it bothered the Arabs living in Palestine so much that they were occupied, why did they wait until the mid-60s to form the PLO? Meaning, the Arabs who lived in Israel at the time, and the ones who lived in the Gaza Strip, and the ones who lived in the West Bank, they didn't say to Egypt, get the hell out of our town. They didn't say
For 20 years.
Only until the Jews took it over and got it back in 67, right?
Was it then a problem?
Was it then a problem? Yeah? So what happened in 67? In 67 the Jews got Gaza back. They actually got the whole of Sinai from Egypt. They also got Samaria and Judea, which was called the West Bank until that point by the Jordanians. Yeah? And Levi Eshkol, who's the Prime Minister, he immediately says to the Palestinians there, if you'll make peace with us, we will give you the land. You can make your own state, like 48. I know you blew it, you blew the opportunity earlier. I'm happy to do it now. That's the kind of guy I am. What's the response of the Arabs? No peace with Israel, no negotiations with Israel, no recognition of Israel. I'm sorry, this is the statement of the Arab League meeting in Khartoum, August 1967. Right, the famous 3 no's. So you can see, in reality, it's never been about occupation, because when they were occupying it, it seemed to be fine. When we're accused of occupying, which by the way we weren't, because it was originally promised to us, yeah. When we are allegedly occupying it, apparently it's a big problem.
Middle class life.
Look, I will say one geopolitical comment. One of the reasons why it's been difficult to get a 2-state solution is because what you don't see on this map over here is the West Bank is hills, and all of the Jews live, besides Jerusalem, all of the Jews live along the coast. So that means if you want to shoot down rockets downhill, it's really easy from the West Bank, which is one of the reasons why just saying, well, why don't you just have a state in the West Bank? Unless we've got peace, we can't go. You can't just go, well, let's unilaterally disengage and whatever, right? It's too dangerous.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go back to where we were. So we've got our statement from the Arab League Secretary. The reality is, by the way, that the Jews, and this was your question, the Jews disengaged from Gaza in 2005 to give Gazan Palestinians a chance to create their own future. Israel forcibly removed Jewish residents. Over here, actually, in Kfar Darom, wrong key. In Kfar Darom, which is a little town here, I have a friend who went on a bus in, I reckon it was 1996. She went on a bus in 1996 for Shabbos, Friday afternoon, and a guy rammed his truck into the side of the bus, and then he pressed a key, like a button on his steering wheel, and his truck blew up. And anyone who didn't have their head down in in the seats. So the blast went straight across, so it killed my friend. And my other friend was checking her bag, like she was getting something from her handbag at the time, so she stayed alive. I remember it, I was in Israel for it. But there were functioning Jewish families here who were all forcibly removed in 2005 because they said, they keep telling us if you just leave us alone, we'll do great, right? So let's leave you alone. That was the thinking behind it. It was only, they by the way, there was a real election, they elected Hamas. It was only in 2007 when Hamas started bombing, shooting rockets into these dudes, right, up here where Israel is, that they built a wall, right, that you hear about the wall, and they only really check things for weapons. They don't stop food and medical supplies going through, they're just, the checkpoints are all about weapons. Egypt, I'll get there in a second. Egypt built a wall over here. How many people did they let through during a day to do work? So you've got 15,000 probably coming up to the war. How many people did Egypt let through to do daily work? El mucho, 0, right? That's my Spanish. It's not really Spanish. Egypt, by the way, built the wall. They don't let anyone through. Even now they won't take Gazan refugees. They'll criticise Israel for not taking any, of course. It's always really been about the Arab inability to accept a Jewish state of any size. That's the idea from the river to the sea. But this is not the cause of anti-Semitism. Jew hatred is the cause of Israel hatred, not the other way around. Okay, so we've gone through our 7 reasons, which we found out aren't reasons, they're actually excuses. Before we look at the real reason for anti-Semitism, I want to spend a couple of minutes looking at what's unusual about anti-Semitism, besides the fact that there are so many excuses. By the way, when you get many, many excuses for something, what you know is none of them are the reason. Yeah?
It's quite depressing.
Yeah, so this is the idea of anti-Semitism. Why does it have its own word? Right, we spoke about this. So, anti-Semite does mean anti-Middle Eastern people, but because the word Semite comes from Shem, one of Noah's sons, but it doesn't mean anti-Middle Eastern person. If you are anti-Semitic, it means not I hate Arabs, it means I hate Jews. It was invented by a German Jew hater named Wilhelm Marr, who John spoke about a couple of weeks ago, to make the hatred sound a little more racial and scientific. This was the book that he wrote it in. So anti-Semitism today is, until Islamophobia, if you'll excuse the expression, until Islam, cultural appropriation, wanted to make their own word for anti-Islam, anti-Semitism was the only kind of racism that had its own word. If you hated blacks, you were racist. If you hated Asians, you were racist. That was just all there was to it. Anti-Semitism has a whole bunch of words that were created just for it because it's so weird. Holocaust, pogrom, ghetto, blood libel, even the word genocide, which we all use sort of whenever something bad's going on, was invented by a Polish lawyer named Dr. Rafał Lemkin, who was leaving Poland to go to England, and he didn't have a word to describe what was happening in Poland, because the systematic destruction of an entire people for no other reason than than who they were was unique in history. And so he came up with this word. So there are 4 things really that Dennis Prager and Joseph Telushkin, who wrote a book called Why the Jews, actually the same year as this seminar came out. The first is longevity, right? The BBC, when they made their television program on anti-Semitism, called their series Anti-Semitism, the Longest Hatred, because that's what it is. As long as we've been around, anti-Semitism has been here. The second is universality. Unlike other forms of hatred, this goes wherever we go. Yeah, it's not a specific, we are next to this person, because when we move towns, or we move countries, it comes with us. The third is its intensity. Right? If you look in the dictionary, it says anti-Semitism is prejudice and hostility towards Jews. I wish that's all it was. The last, and it's not least, is the irrationality of it. Right? You ask a skinhead why they hate blacks or Asians, they'll put up 5 or 6 things on a board. You ask Jews, they'll fill up 16 whiteboards. And they're capitalist and they're communist and they've got too much money. No, they bought off society. Right? They're all these, they're too passive. No, they're too powerful. They're all things that are contradictory. Yeah? So this is Michael Curtis, who's a professor of history at Rutgers University. Anything and everything is a reason to hate the Jew. Whatever you hate the Jew is that. So it seems like anti-Semitism is just a whole list of irrational phenomena. There's no real cause. We're just doomed to be hated for no reason. And we said too many reasons is no reason at all.